the mirror lied to me every single morning, but on this particular morning, I needed it to cooperate. I stood with my feet planted shoulder-width apart, chin tilted just slightly upward, eyes narrowed into what I had practiced as my "don't mess with me" expression. The black fitted blazer helped. The sharp collar of my white dress shirt helped more. My hair, which I had spent 45 minutes styling into something that suggested controlled authority rather than the usual soft chaos it preferred, also helped. Marginally. What did not help was the fact that my face, by some cruel genetic joke, defaulted to an expression that most people described as open or friendly, or on one memorable occasion, like a golden retriever who just spotted a tennis ball. I was 23 years old. I had a master's degree in structural analysis. I had spent 2 years as a junior consultant at a firm where I routinely handled projects worth more than most people earned in a decade. I was, objectively, a competent professional. I was also 5'7", had cheeks that flushed at the slightest provocation, and owned approximately 14 hoodies, none of which I could wear today. "You look fine," I told my reflection. My reflection looked back at me with the kind of gentle skepticism that only a mirror can manage. "You look intimidating," I amended. The reflection remained unconvinced. I picked up my bag, squared my shoulders, and walked out of my apartment into the pale gray morning, telling myself that today was going to be different. Today was the first day at Vance and Mercer Engineering Group, one of the most prestigious structural firms in the country, and I had earned my place here through merit, through relentless work, through sleepless nights, with my face buried in technical manuals and load-bearing calculations. Nobody at Vance and Mercer knew me yet. Nobody had preconceived notions. Nobody knew about the golden retriever face. This was my chance to establish myself as someone serious, someone authoritative, someone not adorable. The Vance and Mercer offices occupied the upper 6 floors of a glass tower in the financial district, and walking through the lobby for the first time as an actual employee rather than an anxious interviewee felt different in a way I hadn't anticipated. The ceiling soared. The floors gleamed. Everything about the space communicated precision and permanence, and I felt the familiar flutter in my chest that came whenever I encountered architecture that had been designed with genuine intention. I loved buildings. I had loved them since I was 7 years old, and my father had taken me to see a cathedral restoration project he was consulting on. And I had stood in the nave staring upward at the ribbed vaulting while the light came through the clerestory windows in long golden columns, and something in my chest had cracked open in the best possible way. I loved the way structures held weight. I loved the invisible conversation between compression and tension, the way a beam could carry a load it seemed like it shouldn't be able to carry, the way good engineering made the impossible look effortless. It was, I had always thought privately, a lot like people. The strongest ones made it look easy. Human resources occupied the 3rd floor, and a woman named Petra walked me through my onboarding paperwork with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this approximately 10,000 times and had precisely no patience for existential reflection. She was not unkind, just economical. She slid documents across the desk, indicated where to sign, and provided information in the rapid-fire cadence of a legal disclaimer read at the end of a pharmaceutical advertisement. Benefits package, reviewed and signed. Emergency contacts submitted. NDA, standard language, reviewed and signed. Office conduct policy, reviewed and signed. Your building access card. She slid a slim white card across the desk. Your department is on floor 14. You'll be working under the Meridian Division, which handles large-scale infrastructure projects. Your direct supervisor is KL Vance. I looked up from the form I was signing. KL Vance as in one of the founding partner's sons, yes. Petra's expression suggested she had answered this question before and found it neither interesting nor particularly relevant. He leads the Meridian team. Brilliant engineer. Demanding. Doesn't suffer inefficiency. Any questions? I had several, but the look on her face suggested none of them would be welcome, so I said, "No, I think I'm good," and signed the last form. "Excellent. Take the elevator to 14. Someone will meet you." Is. Floor 14 smelled like coffee and blueprint paper, and the particular quiet intensity of people who were very good at what they did and knew it. Open-plan desks stretched in organized rows, and the walls were lined with whiteboards covered in calculations and structural diagrams that I instinctively wanted to study. Models sat on shelves and on corners of desks, physical-scale models of bridges and towers and one structure I couldn't immediately identify that looked like it was doing something architecturally provocative with cantilever design. Several people looked up when I stepped out of the elevator. A few nodded. One woman gave me the evaluating once-over that was standard in any competitive workplace and then returned to her screen. A young man with rectangular glasses and a slightly distracted energy appeared at my elbow. "Remy Ashvale? I'm Dax Oren, junior analyst. I'm supposed to get you set up." He stuck out his hand and I shook it. He had the look of someone who had been at the job long enough to stop being anxious, but not quite long enough to be comfortable. "Your desk is over here. Kyl's in his office. He'll want to meet with you, but he's on a call right now. Probably another 20 minutes. "That's fine." I followed him between the rows of desks, trying to look as though I belonged here completely and had never experienced imposter syndrome in my life. "What's the team like?" "Smart. Really smart. Like aggressively smart." Dax said this with the resigned admiration of someone who had learned to live adjacent to genius. KL especially. Look, I'll give you the honest briefing because I wish someone had given it to me. He's exacting. He will notice if your calculations are sloppy. He will notice if you've cut corners. He doesn't get angry about it, which is almost worse. He just looks at your work like it personally disappointed him and then explains exactly what's wrong with it. But he's also, Dax seemed to search for the right word, fair. He's completely fair. If your work is good, he'll say so. He's not one of those people who only gives feedback when something's wrong. "That sounds manageable," I said. "Sure, yeah." Dax adjusted his glasses. "Just, maybe don't be late." He's punctual to the point of it being almost philosophical. My desk was near the window, which I chose to interpret as a good sign. Outside, the city spread in its usual gray and glass morning state, and I could see the skeleton of a construction project 2 blocks over, steel beams rising against the pale sky. I set my bag down, opened my laptop, and began organizing my workspace with the methodical focus of someone who is absolutely not nervous. I was slightly nervous. I took a breath, thought about rib vaulting and load-bearing beams and the silent confidence of structures that had stood for centuries, and felt myself settle. 20 minutes, Dax had said. I had 20 minutes to look like I had always been here. 18 minutes later, the glass door of the corner office opened. The first thing I registered was height. He was tall, in the way that some people are tall, which is to say, not just physically, but in terms of presence. The kind of tall that made a room rearrange itself slightly around his entrance without him seeming to try. He was perhaps 6'2", built with the economical leanness of someone who was active not for aesthetic reasons, but because stillness didn't suit him. Dark hair, a little longer than strictly professional, pushed back from his face, the kind of features that structural engineers would describe as having excellent load distribution, strong jaw, defined planes, nothing excessive or insufficient. He wore his sleeves rolled to the elbows, which meant he had already been working for hours. He was holding a tablet in one hand and a ceramic mug in the other, and he walked with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never been late for anything in his life and couldn't quite conceptualize what that would feel like. KL Vance. He scanned the floor with the quick, comprehensive gaze of someone used to taking in information rapidly, and his eyes landed on me. I was standing. I had stood up when I heard the door open, some instinct toward professional presentation kicking in, and I had my expression arranged in what I hoped was composed and capable and vaguely formidable. He walked toward me without changing his pace, and the rest of the floor, without exactly stopping their work, became slightly more attentive in the way that people do when the person in charge of things is moving through the space. Remy Ashvale, he said, not a question. A statement of recognition, like he was placing a file into the correct folder. That's me. Good, professional, not weird. He looked at me for a moment with that comprehensive gaze, and I maintained my expression with the focused effort of someone holding a difficult yoga pose, and then something happened in his face, a flicker, very brief, of something that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite warmth, but was in the neighborhood of both. "Welcome to Meridian," he said, and then, with the particular calm of someone saying something entirely genuine, he said it. "You look like you're trying very hard to look intimidating." The floor was not large. Several people were within hearing distance. Dax, who was approximately 4 feet to my left, made a sound that was almost certainly a suppressed laugh. I felt the heat start at the base of my neck. I started. "It's not working," KL Vance continued, and his tone was not cruel. It was almost gentle, which was somehow worse. "You look," he tilted his head very slightly, the way someone does when they're genuinely considering a question. "Earnest. Capable, probably. But also," and here he said the word with the same neutral precision he might use to describe a structural measurement, "adorable." The heat reached my face. From somewhere behind me, I heard someone, plural, someones, make the stifled sound of people who were very carefully not reacting. "That," I said with what I considered to have been remarkable composure under the circumstances, "is not a professional assessment." Something shifted in his expression. The flicker became something slightly more defined, and for just a moment I had the disorienting sensation that I had surprised him. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. Come into my office. We'll go over your project assignments." He turned and walked back toward the glass office, and I followed him, acutely aware that every person on floor 14 was watching me do so, and that at least 3 of them were smiling. His office was ordered in the way that intense minds are ordered, not sparse, but precisely allocated. Every item had a purpose and a place. The models on the shelf behind his desk were arranged not decoratively, but analytically, positioned so he could reference them. The whiteboard on his left wall was covered in a working calculation that I recognized as a complex load analysis, and I had to physically restrain the part of my brain that wanted to stop and read it. He sat down and set his mug on the desk with the absolute accuracy of someone who never fumbled anything. I sat across from him and focused very hard on not being visibly flustered. "How familiar are you with the Delancey Overpass project?" he asked, pulling up something on his tablet. "Work. Good. Work I could do. I read the public filing when it was announced," I said. "Multi-span cable-stayed design, significant grade challenges on the eastern approach." The preliminary load analysis that was published had what looked like a conservative assumption in the wind load modeling. His eyes lifted from the tablet. "Which assumption?" he said. "The turbulence intensity coefficient," I said. "The site is in a topographic wind acceleration zone. The preliminary model used the standard open terrain coefficient. Given the valley channeling on the eastern side, I would expect the actual figure to be higher by somewhere between 12 and 18%. Silence. "Then, you read the public filing." "I like to know what a firm is working on before I join it." He studied me across the desk, and the assessment in his gaze was different now, more specific, more interested. "The turbulence intensity discrepancy is an open internal question. We haven't resolved it yet." "I know. I assumed. The public filing didn't address it, and if it had been resolved, the design would have reflected that. The eastern pylon placement is still showing the conservative geometry." "Oh." Something settled in his expression that I didn't quite have the vocabulary for yet. It was satisfaction, but quieter than satisfaction, more like the recognition of a thing he had half expected to find. "You'll be on Delancey," he said. "Wind load analysis and secondary structural review. Dax will brief you on our internal modeling protocols. You have questions? About the project? About anything?" I considered this. "The model on your shelf," I said, "the one with the cantilever." "What is that?" He turned to look at it, and the expression on his face changed again. became something unguarded in a way that felt significant. The way people look when you ask about the thing they actually care about most. Pedestrian bridge concept. Personal project. The geometry is based on a natural rock arch formation. The idea is to design something that looks impossible but isn't. That carries its load so efficiently that the structural system becomes invisible. The strongest things make it look effortless, I said without thinking. The quiet between us shifted. Yes, he said, exactly that. We looked at each other across his desk, and something passed between us that I didn't have a name for yet, and then he picked up his tablet again and said in his customary precise tone, "Meeting with the full Delancey team is tomorrow at 9. Don't be late." "I won't." "I know," he said. "You've got that face." "What face?" The ghost of something, not quite a smile but structurally related to one, appeared at the corner of his mouth. "The one that means you've already decided to do something right." I walked back out to my desk feeling slightly unbalanced in the way that happens when you encounter something, or someone, that doesn't match your existing models. The first 2 weeks at Vance and Mercer were the kind of professionally intense that I genuinely loved, the sort where you fell into your work so completely that you surfaced from it, surprised to find the day gone. The Delancey project was complex and interesting in all the right ways, and the Meridian team was exactly as smart as Dax had warned, in the specific, unpretentious way of people who were too competent to feel the need to perform their competence. I liked them. I liked the work. I liked the quiet hum of the floor on a Friday afternoon when everyone was pushing to finish something before the weekend. I was also acutely, inconveniently aware of KL Vance, in a way that I was fairly certain was not standard professional orientation. It would have been easier if he had been straightforwardly difficult to work with. If the assessment Dax had warned me about had been delivered with the kind of dismissive edge that would have hardened my spine and simplified my feelings into clean professional resentment. But he wasn't. He was precise and demanding and honest, and when he said your work was good, it felt like it meant something real because he didn't say it when it wasn't. He had a way of listening to someone explain a technical problem that was completely attentive without the absent half-listening that most people fell into, and you came away from those conversations having thought more clearly than you had going in. He was also, when he thought nobody was paying attention, quietly funny in a way that was entirely dry and entirely devastating. I caught him once making a small annotation on a drawing in the margin, a tiny, perfect structural diagram that illustrated exactly what was wrong with someone's calculation, labeled simply, "this." He looked up, saw me looking, and said, absolutely deadpan, educational. I thought about it for the rest of the day. The adorable comment had not been repeated. In professional context, he was rigorously appropriate, clear feedback, direct communication, no additional commentary on my facial expressions or my largely unsuccessful attempts at formidable presentation. But I was aware of it. The way you're aware of a structural anomaly you can't quite explain. Present, interesting, requiring further investigation. The team had dinner together on the second Friday. A casual thing, a restaurant, 2 blocks from the office, the sort of gathering that was social but not quite, not work. I sat between Dax and a senior analyst named Yuna, who had the dual quality of being genuinely warm and also someone whose engineering work made me feel moderately humbled. KL sat at the head of the table, which was not a deliberate positioning so much as something that happened naturally because of how rooms organized themselves around him. I had 2 glasses of wine, which meant my face was doing the flushing thing, and I was in the middle of telling Yuna about a cantilever design I'd worked on during my master's program when I became aware that KL was watching me from across the table, not in a way that was obvious to others, in the way someone does when they're listening to something that isn't directed at them. His glass was in his hand, his expression was in its usual composed state, and his eyes were on me. When I caught his gaze, he didn't look away. I did, because I was approximately 4 seconds from the blush of death, and I had a personal policy against spontaneous combustion in public. On the walk back to the office to collect bags, I ended up alongside him, not by design, just by the natural sorting of people on a narrow pavement. Everyone else was slightly ahead or behind. Good first 2 weeks, he said. Thank you. A beat. Was that a professional assessment? He glanced down at me, and the corner of his mouth moved. Mostly. I very carefully did not read into that, the same way you very carefully don't press on a bruise when you're trying to ascertain whether it's serious. The turbulence intensity modeling, I said, pivoting to safer ground with approximately zero subtlety. I've been running the revised coefficients. I think the variance is actually at the higher end of the range I estimated, closer to 18%. Send me the analysis Monday morning. I was going to send it tonight. He stopped walking, which meant I stopped walking, and we were on the pavement with the city moving around us and the office tower lit up overhead. He looked at me with an expression I was beginning to learn, the one that meant he was recalibrating something. You were going to send structural analysis on a Friday night, he said. I finished it this afternoon. I was going to review it once more and send it. Remy. Something about the way he said my name, not my last name, my first name, and with a specific quality of attention, made my chest do something complicated. Yes, send it Monday. Work is important. It is not the whole of things. I looked at him. He looked back at me. The city made its usual evening sounds around us. Okay, I said. Good. We walked the remaining block to the office in silence that was comfortable in a way I hadn't expected. The kind of silence that only happens when two people have already said the thing they needed to say. The third week brought the external review meeting for Delancey, a presentation to the clients, a regional infrastructure committee with opinions and questions, and the particular bureaucratic energy of people whose primary skill was skepticism. I had prepared extensively. I had my analysis clean and documented and ready to defend from any angle. What I had not prepared for was the committee's lead engineer, a man with 3 decades of bridge projects behind him, and the confident certainty of someone who had never been wrong in any way he could acknowledge. Taking a look at my revised turbulence coefficient modeling and saying with generous condescension, I think you'll find the standard coefficient is sufficient. This seems like overcomplication for its own sake. I felt the particular internal temperature change that happens when someone dismisses work they haven't actually examined. With respect, I said, keeping my voice level, the standard coefficient is a terrain-averaged figure. The site-specific topography creates a valley acceleration effect that isn't captured by the standard model. The revised coefficient accounts for measured wind data from the nearest 3 monitoring stations over a 5-year period. The committee lead smiled in the way that people smile when they're not actually engaging with what you've said. Theoretical. Empirical, I said. The room was quiet. From the side of the table, said nothing. He was watching with his characteristic complete attention, and I was aware of him without looking at him, the way you're aware of a load-bearing element even when you're focused on something else. The calculations are in the documentation package, I continued, page 17 through 23. The valley channeling effect is well documented in wind engineering literature. If you'd like, I can walk you through the specific references. The committee lead looked at me for a moment with the reassessing expression of a man who had expected less resistance. We'll review the documentation, he said. Not a concession, but also not a dismissal. The meeting continued. When it ended and the committee filed out, KL appeared at my shoulder. Page 17 through 23, he said quietly, and his tone had that dry, precise quality that I had learned to recognize as his version of pleased. I had a feeling I'd need the exact reference. You were right. A pause. You held your ground well. I had good data. Having good data and knowing how to present it under pressure are different skills, he said. You have both. I was extremely glad that my back was to the room because my face did exactly what it always did, and I spent a moment studying the conference table very intently. Thank you, I managed. Go eat lunch, he said. You've been in here since 7. Something shifted after that meeting, in the way that something shifts when two people have seen each other in a specific kind of moment and the information is irreversible. It wasn't dramatic. It was more like a structural change, the kind that happens incrementally, load by load, until one day you notice that the building is carrying more weight than it was before and you have to update your model. We talked more. Not in manufactured ways. It arose naturally from the work, from questions and problems, and the long hours that the Delancey timeline was beginning to demand. But the conversations drifted beyond the technical in the way conversations do when the people having them are genuinely interested in each other. He told me about the pedestrian bridge concept. Not just the structural design, but the origin, a hiking trip he had taken alone after finishing his doctorate, when he had stumbled on a natural stone arch formation in an eroded valley and had stood underneath it for a long time thinking about how it worked. Everything about it was technically improbable, he said. The span, the thickness, the loading. By any rational assessment, it shouldn't be standing. But it was, and it was beautiful. Because it had been doing it long enough that it had proven itself, I said. He looked at me with that recalibrating expression. Yes, exactly. I told him about the cathedral when I was 7, about my father and the light through the clerestory windows, about the feeling of a structure that had stood for 800 years, that had absorbed the weight of centuries and was still, impossibly, standing. That's why I do this, I said. Not because I want to build things that are impressive, because I want to build things that last. We were in his office, working late on revised calculations. The city dark outside the windows, and the quiet had the particular quality of late nights in buildings, more honest than the daytime somehow. As though the absence of other people created a different kind of space. He was quiet for a moment after I said that. Then he said, with the careful precision he brought to things that mattered to him, "That's the right reason." I wanted to say something in response. But what happened instead was that I looked at him, and he looked at me, and the air between us had a quality I didn't have an engineering term for. Then my laptop pinged with an email from the committee lead requesting 3 additional calculations, and the moment dissolved into work, which was probably correct given the circumstances. Dax found me in the kitchen one morning, making my second coffee, with what was apparently a revealing expression. "So," he said, leaning against the counter with the casual energy of someone building to something. "No," I said. "I haven't said anything." "You have a face. You have a face," he said, which was arguably fair. "The face you've been making every time KL talks to you for the past 3 weeks." "I don't have a face. Remy, I work 4 desks from you. You have a face." I poured my coffee with great deliberation. "He's my supervisor." "He is." "That's a significant complication." "It is." Dax considered. "Are you going to let it be an insurmountable one?" I looked at him. He looked back with the equanimity of someone who had thought about this more than I had. Dax, I had come to understand, was perceptive in a way that was easy to underestimate because he wore it so lightly. "I don't know what he thinks," I said, which was the honest answer. Dax's expression did something that was very carefully neutral. "Right," he said. "Okay, what does that mean?" "It means, right, okay." He picked up his coffee and walked away with the serene energy of someone who had said exactly as much as he meant to. The Delancey project hit a significant problem in week 5. The geotechnical survey on the eastern approach came back with results that revised the foundation load assumptions considerably. The soil stratification was more variable than the initial boring data had suggested, and the bedrock depth on the eastern pylon location was 12 meters deeper than modeled. It was the kind of problem that wasn't catastrophic but was serious, and it required a comprehensive redesign of the eastern foundation system under a timeline that was already under pressure. KL called a team meeting at 7 in the morning, and I arrived to find that I was not the first one there. He was already at the whiteboard, and he had already begun decomposing the problem with the structured intensity that I had come to recognize as his mode when something required complete focus. We worked for 11 hours that day, the whole team revolving around the problem from different angles. KL coordinated it the way a conductor coordinates an orchestra, not directing each individual movement but holding the overall structure, keeping the integration, ensuring that the solutions being developed in parallel were actually going to fit together. It was, I thought, watching him from across the room, one of the most technically impressive things I had ever witnessed in person. By 6 that evening, we had a foundation redesign framework that addressed the geotechnical constraints without compromising the structural system. It was better than the original design in several respects. The deeper pylon foundation actually improved the lateral load response, and the revised geometry allowed for a slight adjustment in cable geometry that KL had been considering as an optimization anyway. When the team dispersed, I stayed to finish documenting the analysis I had contributed, so did KL. At some point, I looked up and realized the floor was empty and the lights had dimmed to their after-hours level, and it was 9:30 at night. And KL was at his desk with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up and his hair less perfectly arranged than usual. And he was looking at his screen with the expression of someone who was satisfied, not triumphantly, just quietly. The expression of someone who had done difficult work and it had gone the way it needed to go. I must have made some sound because he looked up. "You should go home," he said. "So should you." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite surprise, but its neighbor. "You're not usually that direct." "I'm usually at work," I said. "It's 9:30. This is different." He looked at me for a moment, then he closed his laptop. "Come on, I'll walk you out." We went down in the elevator together, and the building lobby was empty and cool, and outside the city had its usual nighttime state of restless golden light. We stood on the pavement and neither of us moved immediately toward a cab or the transit entrance, and the pause felt deliberate. "Good work today," he said. "Collective good work. Yes. But yours specifically." His voice had the particular quality it got when he was being precise about something that mattered. "The foundation response analysis, the way you integrated the lateral load implications, that was elegant." Something warm moved through my chest. "That's a professional assessment," I said. "Yes. Is that the only kind you have?" The words came out before I had authorized them, which was a complete structural failure in my intended communication plan. I felt the heat in my face and prepared for the floor to open and provide me a convenient exit. What happened instead was that KL Vance went very still for a moment, the way a careful person goes still when they're making a decision. And then he looked at me with an expression that was different from anything I had seen from him before. Something opened, something real, something with none of the composed professional distance that was his default. "No," he said, "it isn't." The city moved around us. A cab passed. Someone was talking loudly half a block away. "The adorable comment," I said, because apparently my mouth had decided to continue being brave without consulting the rest of me, on my first day. I shouldn't have said it. "Was it true?" Another pause. "The honest kind." "Yes," he said, embarrassingly so. My heart was doing something completely structurally unsound. "That's also not a professional assessment." "No," he met my eyes. "It isn't." We stood there on the pavement looking at each other, and the thing that had been building for 5 weeks was present in the air between us with all the patient inevitability of a load that had reached its limit. "There are complications," I said. "I know. You're my supervisor. I know that too. And you still—" I stopped. "Remy." The way he said my name had the same quality it had had that evening 2 weeks ago. Specific, attentive, like the name itself meant something. "I've been aware of the complications since week 1. I've been managing them conscientiously. But I'm also—" He paused in the way he paused when he was choosing words with care, "finding it increasingly difficult to maintain the pretense that what I feel when I look at you is purely professional." I was definitely blushing. The night air was cool, and my face was approximately the temperature of a forge. "Okay," I said. "Okay? I took a breath. "I feel the same, for the record." In case that was a question. "Sao." Something happened to his face that I had never seen before. Something that broke through the composed precision entirely. Something unguarded and young and luminous. And for a moment, he looked nothing like the formidable senior engineer who ran floor 14 with quiet authority, and everything like a person who had just received news that mattered to him. "We should be careful," he said. "The professional context is real. I know. We should go slowly." "Also fine. Also fine. And we should. Remy, you're smiling. I know. I'm trying to be responsible about this. You're also smiling, I pointed out. He pressed his lips together in an attempt at composure that was only partially successful. I'm not. Structurally, you are. There was a beat, and then he laughed. A real laugh, unexpected and genuine, and I felt it like a key turning in something I hadn't known was locked. He shook his head. Go home, he said, but his voice was entirely different now, warm in a way that reoriented everything. Good night, KL. Good night. I walked to the transit entrance feeling approximately 3 feet off the ground, and I didn't look back. But I knew, with the structural certainty of things you can feel before you can prove, that he was still standing there. Going slowly, as it turned out, was a philosophy we both held in principle and consistently failed to maintain in practice. Not because of any dramatic breach, but because of the relentless accumulation of small things. The coffee he left on my desk on mornings when the project timeline was crushing. The way he made time to explain something I was struggling with, not by giving me the answer, but by asking exactly the right questions to lead me there myself. The afternoon he caught me staring at the cantilever model and instead of commenting, came and stood next to me and talked about it for 40 minutes in the way people talk about things they genuinely love, with a thoroughness and a specificity that made me understand both the bridge and the person more completely. The way I learned slowly that his composure was not emotional distance, but rather something like structural integrity, that there was feeling underneath it, a great deal of it, and that it expressed itself in attentive care rather than visible volatility. He remembered things, he noticed things, he showed up quietly and reliably in the way that good load-bearing elements show up, without announcing themselves, just there. I also learned, in these weeks, that I was somewhat less of a mystery to myself than I had been. The golden retriever face, it turned out, was not a liability to be overcome, but simply a thing I had, an openness of expression that reflected a genuine openness of disposition, and that several people, KL prominently among them, appeared to find not ridiculous, but something closer to its opposite. You're easy to read, Dax told me one afternoon. This was, I had learned, a compliment from Dax, who had infinite patience for complexity in engineering and very little for complexity in people. Sayel isn't. You balance each other. We're not. I started. You absolutely are, he said, with the serenity of someone who considered the matter settled. He was, as usual, not wrong. The first time KL and I had dinner that wasn't work, that was explicitly, deliberately not work. Arranged in advance and acknowledged as a different thing from the takeout containers on late project nights, was on a Saturday evening 6 weeks after the conversation on the pavement. He had chosen a restaurant that was small and specific and interesting in a way that suggested he had thought about it carefully. Not impressive for the sake of impressive. Actually good. The kind of place that cared about the thing it was doing. He wore a navy jacket over a dark shirt and looked so thoroughly like himself, collected and precisely present, that I spent approximately 3 minutes in the cab ride over telling myself to be a normal person about this. Across the table from each other, without a desk or a whiteboard or a structural problem between us, felt different in a way that should have been disorienting but wasn't. It was easier, somehow, than I had expected. He asked about my family and listened with the complete attentiveness that was his characteristic mode. And when I asked about what it was like to have grown up with a parent who had built the firm he now worked in, he answered honestly. Without the deflection that some people used when the question touched on something complicated. There was pressure, he said, not from him directly, he's always been careful about that, but the name is the name, the expectation is structural. You don't choose it, it just is. Did you ever want something different? No. He held my gaze with the directness he brought to things he was certain about. I always wanted this, the work, specifically. The name attached to it was incidental. I had to make it mine through the work, not through the inheritance. Is that why you're demanding? I said, with the team. I'm demanding because good work matters, he said. Because structures hold people's lives. Because the difference between careful and careless can be measured in consequences that are not abstract. A beat. But yes. Also because I needed to earn what I have. I suppose that made me rigorous, I said. He looked at me. I was going to say uncompromising. Those are the same thing. Are they? The best version of them is. He was quiet for a moment and then he smiled. Not the ghost of one, not the structural approximation, but a real one, full and genuine. And I thought that building a thing was one of the most extraordinary acts a person could engage in, whether the material was steel and concrete or something that had no physical mass at all. We walked after dinner without a plan through the district where the city had its older architecture, the buildings from an earlier century that had survived by a combination of good construction and luck, the kind of structures that wore their age visibly, without apology. He stopped at a building I had stopped at before, a mid-century civic building with a facade that did something interesting with repeated geometric forms. And the expression on his face, when he looked at it, was the same expression he'd had when I'd asked about the cantilever bridge. Good bones, I said. The best kind of compliment. He was looking at the upper cornice, where a subtle structural articulation showed through the surface treatment. It was built by someone who knew that the structure itself was the beauty. Everything else was in service to that. Everything else is in service to that, I said, and I wasn't only talking about the building. He turned to look at me. We were standing close. The natural proximity of people who have been moving toward each other for weeks. And the evening air had that particular quality of early autumn, cool and clean. And the building stood behind me doing its quiet structural work. Remy, he said. Yes, I need to say something, and I'd like to say it correctly. Okay, he took a breath. KL Vance, who stood in front of infrastructure committees and managed teams of brilliant engineers and made decisions worth millions without apparent hesitation, took a breath. I'm not good at this. The part that isn't work. I understand load paths, and I understand structural behavior, and I understand, at a technical level, most things. But this, what happens when I'm with you, this doesn't fit my existing models. That's terrifying for an engineer, I said softly. It is. The corner of his mouth moved. It's also, I keep thinking about what you said. About the stone arch. About something that works in a way that shouldn't be explainable by the standard analysis. My heart was in my throat. I think you are that to me, he said, with the particular careful honesty of someone who has measured a thing before committing to it. Something I can't fully model. Something that is doing something to my structural calculations that I cannot account for by existing theory. I looked at him for a moment. Then, that is the most engineer way anyone has ever told me something like that. It's the only way I know how. I know. I reached up and did the thing I had been thinking about for weeks, pressed my hand lightly against his chest over his heart, where his jacket was warm and his heartbeat was steady and a little faster than usual. For the record, you've been doing exactly the same thing to mine. He looked down at my hand, and then at my face, and then something in his entire bearing shifted, let go of something it had been holding, and he reached up and covered my hand with his. Warm and certain. The adorable thing, he said. First day, I need to apologize for that properly. It was unprofessional. It was honest. It was both. You can make it up to me, I said. How? By never calling me that in front of the whole floor again. A pause. I wasn't planning to. He tilted his head slightly. Although the expression on your face right now is, do not finish that sentence. Very? V-R-C. Z. Very. C. Notable. He finished, and his voice had dropped into something lower and warmer, and his hand was still over mine, and the city was doing its quiet nighttime thing around us. And I was standing outside an old building that had stood for decades through everything because someone had built it to last. And I thought, with the certainty of a calculation that has checked out from every angle, that some things were like that. Some things were built right from the beginning. Some things had the right bones. 3 months into working at Vance and Mercer, I had become, by all observable metrics, a member of the Meridian team rather than the new addition to it. I knew the rhythms of the floor. I knew who made the best coffee and who would eat the last of the shared snacks without restocking them, and which of the senior engineers wanted questions asked in writing, and which preferred face-to-face. I knew that Yuna could solve a structural problem faster on a whiteboard than she could at a computer, and that Dax worked best with music playing, and that the fourth-floor kitchen was better stocked than ours, and nobody knew why. I also knew, in the particular way of someone who had stopped being uncertain about it, that KL Vance looked at me differently than he looked at everything else. That the comprehensive gaze that processed his professional world with such efficient precision became something else when it landed on me. Something attentive and private and warm in a way that he didn't bother to fully conceal. Which I understood was its own kind of statement from a person of his natural reticence. We were careful at work. Not performatively. Not with the strained performance of people who are hiding something and overcompensating, but with genuine professionalism because it mattered to both of us that the work be the work. He gave feedback on my analyses with the same directness he gave everyone's. I challenged his conclusions when I thought the data supported it and agreed when it didn't. We were colleagues in the full sense, which was part of what made everything else feel as solid as it did. Outside of work was different, and had been quietly, continuously building into something substantial in the way that good structures build, incrementally, load by load, each addition carefully supported by what was already there. The pedestrian bridge was the thing I kept coming back to. Not literally, it was still a concept model on his shelf, hadn't progressed beyond that, but the idea of it, the stone arch in the valley that shouldn't have been standing. The structural system so efficient that it became invisible, and all you experienced was the bridge itself, the span, the crossing. One Saturday, we drove out of the city. 3 hours on a highway that eventually became a smaller road, that eventually became a track into an eroded valley region that he'd been researching for topographic data relevant to the bridge concept. It wasn't the location of the original arch he'd found. That was on the other side of the country, but it had similar geological characteristics, and he wanted to see it. The valley was extraordinary. The rock formations were old and layered, the kind of geology that told time through color and texture, and the erosion had produced an environment that felt sculptural, shapes that seemed intentional even though they were entirely natural, forms that had been produced by wind and water over millions of years, with no consciousness of the elegance they were creating. We walked for 2 hours along the valley floor, and I mostly listened while he talked about what he was seeing technically. The rock stress patterns, the natural arch formation mechanics, the way certain structures had lasted while adjacent features had eroded. He talked about rock the way some people talk about music or literature or any art form they'd spent a lifetime in close study of, and it made everything I looked at come alive with a significance it hadn't had 5 minutes before. Here, he said, stopping at a point where a natural arch formation spanned a gap in the rock face. Not dramatic, not as large as the one he'd first found, but present, real, doing its quiet structural work. He stood below it with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked up at the Keystone region with the same expression as the model on his shelf. I stood next to him and looked at it too. There's no reason it should be standing, he said. The span-to-depth ratio is far outside what conventional analysis would predict. But it is. But it is. Because it knows something we haven't modeled yet, I said. He looked at me. The afternoon light came through the arch and fell across his face, and he looked, in this moment, entirely unlike the figure who stood at the head of conference tables and managed teams of engineers. He looked like the person underneath that, the one who had stood in a valley as a young man and felt something crack open in his chest. Yes, he said, that's it exactly. I reached over and took his hand, and he turned his palm up immediately, naturally, like the response was already decided before the question was asked. His fingers closed around mine. I want to build it, he said. Someday. I want to build something that does what this does, that works so cleanly that it looks impossible. You will. How do you know? Because you've been thinking about it since you were a student. I turned to face him. And because you're the kind of person who builds things that last. He looked at me with that open, unguarded expression that I had come to think of as his real face, the one underneath the composed professional surface, the one I got to see. You say things, he said, that recalibrate something in me. Every time. Is that a structural metaphor? Probably. I don't know how to speak without them. I love that about you, I said, and the words came out simply, without premeditation, and hung in the air between us with the weight of something true. The quiet that followed had a quality I could feel. He turned to face me fully, and I was looking up at him in the shadow of the arch, and he brought his free hand up to the side of my face. Careful. Warm. And looked at me for a moment before he said quietly, I love you, for the record. My chest did something that defied conventional load analysis. For the record, I said, I love you too. He kissed me under the arch of an impossible bridge in a valley where the geology had been building toward this configuration for millions of years, and I thought that some calculations, no matter how long they take, come out right. The Delancey Overpass broke ground 8 months after I joined Vance and Mercer. The foundation system used our revised design. The wind load modeling used my corrected turbulence coefficients. On the morning of the groundbreaking ceremony, I stood at the site and looked at the cleared earth and the survey stakes and the beginning of something that would carry weight across a span for the next 100 years, and felt the particular fullness that comes from work that matters. KL stood next to me, and his arm was warm against mine, and the site was loud with the sounds of a thing beginning. How does it feel? He asked. Like something that's going to last, I said. His hand found mine, hidden between us where the crowd couldn't see, and held it. The project would take 3 years to complete. There would be problems. There were always problems. Weather and budget, and the 1,000 unexpected complications that real-world construction produced. There would be long nights, and revised calculations, and moments where the solution wasn't visible yet, and you had to trust the process. There would be all of that. But the foundation was right, the structure was sound. And some things, when they're built correctly from the beginning, carry every load you put on them. They make it look effortless. On the day the Delancey Overpass opened, 3 years, 2 months. And 11 days after I had stood in front of my mirror trying to look intimidating for my first day of work, I walked across it for the first time. The cables rose around me in their geometric precision, and the valley below was doing its usual thing with the wind, and the eastern pylon sat on the foundation we had redesigned in that 11-hour session. Solid and certain in the soil that had given us such trouble. The deck surface was smooth under my feet. The railing was warm from the afternoon sun. At the midpoint of the span, I stopped and looked out. The view was extraordinary. The valley stretched in both directions, the road disappearing into the landscape on either side, and the structure I was standing on held me above it all with the quiet competence of something that knew exactly what it was doing. KL appeared at my side. He had been at the far end, speaking with the committee lead, who had, over the 3 years of the project, moved from dismissive to respectful in the way that people do when the work proves itself beyond argument. Now he was here, and he was looking at the same view I was looking at. Well, he said. Well, I agreed. He was quiet for a moment, and then he turned to look at me, and his expression had that quality that I had first seen on a pavement outside the office 2.5 years ago. Open, luminous, entirely genuine. Adorable, he said. I turned to stare at him. In the best possible sense, he said, and not in front of the whole floor. You. I started, and then I was laughing, which was the only appropriate response, and after a moment, so was he there on the midpoint of the bridge we had built together. Above the valley, where the wind moved, the way we had calculated, it would, at the exact intersection of every load path we had modeled and argued over and stayed up late to get right. The bridge held us both without effort. It knew it could. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.